My name is Richard Hillman. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Sydney and Course Director for the Master's Programme in HIV, STIs and Sexual Health. I'm also a sexual health physician with a particular research interest in STIs and HIV in males. What I'd like to do today is to talk about anal cancer, a condition which we'll see is devastating certain sections of our community. We have a number of presentations which you may wish to view. In this series of presentations we will be talking about anal cancer, who it affects, what conditions may be associated with the development of anal cancer, and what procedures may be undertaken to identify those at particular high risk of anal cancer. Why is anal cancer so important? Well, a number of studies now have shown that it's increasing incidence. It's a degrading condition when it does occur, associated with significant morbidity and mortality. Treatments for anal cancer include chemotherapy, radiotherapy and surgical excision, all of which are associated with a considerable amount of unpleasantness. In the best available hands, with standard procedures, there's only a 60 to 70% 5-year survival. So clearly anal cancer is a very major problem which we need to understand better and to develop proper screening procedures. Anal cancer is rare in the general community, occurring at a rate of about 1 case per 100,000 population. As you can see from the graph, the most common cancers in males are prostate cancer, followed by colorectal cancer, and the most common cancers in females are breast cancer. In comparison, anal cancer is much less common. However, if you look at specific parts of our community, for example gay men, you'll find the rates are substantially higher. The rates of anal cancer in HIV-negative gay men are something of the order of 20 to 30 cases per 100,000 population. And in HIV-positive men, it can be up to 140 cases per 100,000 population. So as you can see from this graph, in HIV-positive gay men, the rates of anal cancer approximate to that of the most common cancers in the general population, that is breast and prostate cancer. So within certain subpopulations, anal cancer is indeed a very important and significant condition. You will also see from this graph that cervical cancer is relatively uncommon in Australia, occurring at rates between 6 to 7 cases per 100,000 population. However, 20-30 years ago, before the introduction of cervical screening program, the rates were much higher, typically 30 to 40 cases per 100,000 population. The dramatic reduction in the rates of cervical cancer in our community have occurred as a consequence of the introduction of widespread, well-designed cervical screening programs, including pap smears and colposcopy. There are a number of epidemiological, biological, and behavioral similarities between anal cancer and cervical cancer. So a considerable amount of research has been undertaken to see whether we can develop comparable screening programs for anal cancer and have the same sort of effect on the rates of anal cancer as we've managed to achieve with cervical cancer. At this point, I think I'd like to mention the potential benefit of vaccination against human papillomavirus. As I'm sure you're all aware, HPV vaccination is now widely available in many developed countries, specifically reducing the risk of cervical cancer in our young women. Whilst this is an extremely important development and ultimately will lead to dramatic reductions in cervical cancer, the lead time of these cancers is such that the impact is going to take many decades. We hope eventually that males will also be vaccinated against HPV, which also is likely to result in significant reductions in the rates of anal cancer in gay men. However, because this condition takes many decades to develop, it's unlikely we're going to see a significant impact on the reduction in the development of anal cancer for 30 or 40 years. In the meantime, people who have already acquired HPV infection are going to be increased risk of developing anal cancer, and we need to develop procedures to identify such individuals for the foreseeable future. Not only is anal cancer more common in gay men and HIV-positive gay men, it's also more common in people who are immunosuppressed, for example, in renal transplant recipients and individuals with other causes of immunosuppression. Increasing data suggests that women with a history of cervical dysplasia or cervical cancer are 6 to 7 times more likely to develop anal cancer themselves. So you can see from this table, a number of groups within our society are at a very significantly elevated risk of anal cancer. Without doubt, the most important risk factor for the development of anal cancer is infection with certain strains of Wart virus, particularly HPV-16. In addition, smoking not only is associated with lung cancer and cardiovascular disease, but also a significantly elevated risk of anal cancer. Finally, impaired immunity, particularly in the context of HIV infection, but also in the context of immunosuppressive therapy following, for example, renal transplant, is associated with the development of anal cancer. I'd like to spend a little bit of time now talking specifically about Wart virus infection, because this is probably the most important factor leading to the development of anal cancer. It's important to realise that infection with human papillomavirus or Wart virus is very common indeed. Most sexually active people will have been exposed to the virus at some stage in their sex lives. If you've had one lifetime sexual partner, you've got approximately a 20% chance of being exposed to the Wart virus. If you've had 4 or more sex partners in your entire life, then it's almost inevitable that you'll have been exposed to Wart virus at some stage in your life. Fortunately, most people who come into contact with Wart virus infection clear the infection without any adverse consequences whatsoever. However, in a small minority of individuals, the Wart virus persists, and that persisting Wart virus can have various effects. With certain strains of Wart virus, it leads to clinically apparent warts in the anogenital region. However, in a small minority of individuals, the infection with other types of Wart virus lead to persisting Wart virus infection, which is usually not clinically apparent, and that can be on the external genitalia or within the anus. A small minority of individuals with persisting Wart virus infection, particularly with type 16, can go on to develop anal cancer. It's rather unclear at the moment why such individuals do develop problems with HPV infection, but the suggestion is it may be a genetic predisposition to mishandle the Wart virus, whereas most of us are able to clear the virus with our immune system. So I'd like to now briefly review the structure of the anus. As you'll see from this diagram, the anus is made of 2 major linings. On the outside of the anus, the skin which surrounds the buttocks folds into the anus, and then about 2 to 3 centimeters inside the anus, it changes dramatically to a much softer, more fragile form of lining called a mucosa, which is very similar to the inside of our mouths. And it's this junction between the paler outer skin and the soft fleshy inside which is very, very important and the most common site for the development of anal cancer. In some ways it's rather like the lips of your face, this junction between the paler outer skin and the soft fleshy skin. As I say, this is typically about 3 centimeters inside the anus, and so is not usually visible. Tests looking for the development of anal cancer precursors therefore focus on this junction between the paler outer skin and the soft fleshy skin. This diagram is meant to represent some of the changes that occur following Wart virus infection of the anal lining. You can see on the left-hand side is a circular diagram, and this is meant to represent the overall structure of the anus. Changes associated with the development of anal cancer occur in the lining of the anus, the inner circle you can see in the diagram. If we look more closely at the inner lining of the anus, on the left-hand side of this diagram, which is labelled normal, you can see there is a steady progression of cells starting from the basal epithelium of the cell, progressing up to the top layers. And you can see these cells get larger and flatter, and in fact are then shed into the opening of the anus as part of the normal cellular turnover. When an individual comes into contact with Wart virus and the Wart virus persists, then the cells react to the presence of the Wart virus by changing their shape. You can see listed here as low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion, or LSIL, that the cells again start off at the basement, and then on this occasion they get much bigger and produce what are called coilocytes, which are then shed from the lining of the anus. In fact, that's the way that Wart virus is transmitted, by coilocytes and other cells containing new Wart virus particles, which are then passed on to sexual partners. Coilocytes and associated changes are an entirely benign phenomenon and are not associated with any predisposition to anal cancer. In a minority of cases, individuals will react adversely to the presence of certain strains of Wart virus and develop what's called dysplasia. The term dysplasia just means some cells which have unusual characteristics and are less able to be controlled by the normal tissue processes. You can see there an area called high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion, AIN2 or AIN3. And looking at those pictures there, you see that a substantial proportion of the thickness of the lining is replaced by these so-called dysplastic cells. You can notice that the dysplastic cells are smaller than the other cells and they're chaotically arranged. That's because the cells have lost the ability to be controlled by our bodies. In itself, high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion, or HSIL, is not damaging. The concern associated with HSIL is that it will ultimately progress to the development of anal cancer. And you can see that's represented by the final column in the diagram. In cancer, you get so-called full-thickness dysplasia, where the whole thickness of the lining is replaced by these dysplastic cells, and they begin to progress through the lining of the anus and spread into adjacent parts of the body. When that happens, the individual is said to have anal cancer.